So again, welcome. And for our workshop, we'll ask our speaker to give brief opening remarks to introduce the topic. And then we'll ask two main questions in which the speaker will respond to. And then we'll open the floor for questions from our workshop participants. And if we still have time at the end of those two questions, we can keep the discussions open from further questions from our participants. Okay. So for today, we are honored to have Dr. Ruth Castel-Branco. She is research manager for the program called Future of Work at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies based in the University of Witwatersrand. Okay. So welcome, Dr. Ruth.
Thanks so much, Dr. Benjamin Velasco. It is a pleasure to be here in this conversation. And I thought that I would do a presentation that didn't repeat the video because my assumption is that most people have watched the video and that reflects in a first instance on some of the politics actually of minimum wage setting, looking at the South African and Mozambican example, and then some of the, let's say, broader questions and debates. And then I'll take the questions that Benjamin will put forward. I didn't actually address those on purpose, although some of the debates will sort of reproduce or will point towards them. So I think, there's a lot of African countries, and I know African labor markets better. A lot of African countries have sectoral minimum wages. And in the context of Mozambique, which is where I'm from, sectoral minimum wages were actually introduced during the transition from a socialist to a market economy and the introduction of structural adjustment programs. And they were very much a World Bank and IMF recommendation. And as you see, this doesn't include all of the sectors, the graph on the left, but the first sector to be separated was agriculture. So the first differentiation was between the agricultural and non-agricultural sector. And the reason for that was that it was a mechanism to keep the wages of agriculture.
6%. Matthew, 6%. Timekeeper Indian.
Welcome, Razak. Perhaps you can go on mute.
I think it's Joconia. Hi, Joconia. Could you unmute?
Timekeeper Indian.
Joconia, could you maybe go on mute? I think we can mute him. I think I can mute you. I've muted him. He can unmute. And so just, going back to the sort of differentiation between agricultural and non-agricultural workers, the objective was to keep agricultural workers' wages down. And the reason for that was that the economic strategy of development in Mozambique at the time was a low-road extractivist development model that hinged on maintaining or hinged on an ultra-low-wage agricultural workforce, right? And so it's important to recognize that how we set minimum wages is very much tied to the kind of development models that we have and the kinds of assumptions that are moved forward. And with structural adjustment, there was a reorientation of the economy to export-oriented extractivist sectors, and that then required this sectoralization, let's say, of minimum wages. Now, what we've seen, and I've put these according to the US dollar, you can see on the right, is a erosion of wages over time. And the US dollar is not a bad way to compare these because particularly in cities, Mozambique is heavily reliant on imports, including imported food. So these questions around the exchange rate really matter. And what you see is that it hasn't just been the agricultural sector that has suffered. Over time, you've seen erosion in a range of sectors, including most recently the public sector, which given Mozambique's relatively small economy, is actually the dominant employer. nearly half of all salaried employment is in the public sector, and nearly the other half is in the agricultural. And so you have now a combination of export-oriented extractivist development combined with austerity measures in the public sector, and the minimum wages then and the transitions of that reflect that. So what are the problems with minimum wages? Well, they perpetuate wage inequality. As we've seen, they ignore the structure of accumulation and the kind of aggregate effects, right, of productivity growth. So you end up negotiating. I don't know, I'm interested to find out how it is in everyone's countries here, but you end up negotiating wages based on rather dubious projections of productivity growth sectorally. It excludes a large percentage of workers, particularly in a context of high levels of casualization, as is the case in South Africa and also in Mozambique. Estimates suggest, based on Social Security data, that at least about half of private sector workers in Mozambique are in highly casualized relations. And it makes enforcement extremely difficult, because really, what is the minimum wage? It's very difficult to know, right? Now, there has been a shift towards national minimum wages, and South Africa being one of the case studies. And I think it's important to recognize that this commitment to a national minimum wage happened following an unprecedented number of strike actions that paralyzed South Africa in key sectors, mining and agriculture being some of them. And that led the government to propose the idea of a national minimum wage in order to reduce wage inequality, which in the South African context is the main driver. It's not the only driver, but it's the main driver of high levels of inequality, and reflects the historical apartheid labor structure. But that was one reason. But the other one that was promoted by government very clearly was labor market stability, right? Now, there were many debates, and we can get into these in more detail later, but one of them was, of course, the question of jobs. So, South Africa already had high levels of unemployment. What will a national minimum wage do? But of course, we then embarked on a series of meta studies. At this time, I was working at the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative, which showed that actually increases in wages don't necessarily lead to unemployment, right? On one hand, companies have a range of costs, right? And they make decisions based on a range of factors. And there's ways to adjust for increases in labor costs. That there's also that reducing the number of workers is not necessarily the most efficient way to reduce costs, and that higher wages can stimulate higher spending and increase demands for goods and services in the economy, which in turn can generate employment, right? So we couldn't apply a sectoral approach to understanding what would be the impact of a national minimum wage. You needed to go beyond that. The second one was, well, this will only benefit the labor aristocracy. I'm sure many here are familiar with these arguments. And of course, this is based on an assumption that we operate in a dual economy, right? But actually, evidence has widely refuted this. There's an interconnection between the formal and informal, and minimum wages, provide a sort of lighthouse effect, a reservation wage on one hand, but also sort of help guide what wages can be in the informal economy. A third debate was, okay, well, what parameters should then be decided to define the level of the national minimum wage? And here, international evidence and from a range of places helped us in kind of thinking about what were different models. There was this was a highly contentious area, and we can speak more about this, but the basic sort of premise was that it should meet workers' basic needs, so that it was not a valuable policy process if we ended up keeping wages so low that they made very little difference in the lives of workers, right? But of course, one of the challenges you have when you have a sectoral wage system is that you have a huge diversity between workers, the wages of the lowest paid workers and the wages of the highest paid workers. I mean, that's the objective, right, of how these sectoral wage systems were created. And so when we decided that the minimum wage, in order to have an effect, had to be between 3,500 and 5,000 rands, but domestic workers and agricultural workers were earning about half of that, then the question was, will this be viable, right? And what happened is that business, in fact, used the fact that you had ultra low wage work to try to justify and pull the proposed national minimum wage down. And what ended up happening, and this was through a process of social dialogue, was that we ended up settling on this idea of a phase-in approach, right? That the minimum wage should remain somewhere between that level of 3,500, 4,000 or 5,000 rands, so that it had to stay somewhere there, and ended up being 4,500 rand, but that you would have a phase-in approach in order that those sectors that were really right at the bottom could over time be incorporated. And we'll talk about the advantages of that, but also the problems with that later. The fifth debate was, well, okay, what should happen with these categories like young people and apprentices and so on? And the rationale there was that they must be included, that there is no evidence that justifies the exclusion of these groups or their inclusion at a lower level. And then, the other debate was, well, okay, what should this wage encompass? And specifically, should tips count towards compliance with the national minimum wage and other allowances? And here we really, we made our argument based on existing sectoral determinations, right? And we tried to pick what were the sort of best practices within each one of those sectoral determinations, and then argued that any national minimum wage could not offer a worse practice than that one. And so for that reason, tips were not included. They did not count towards that. And rather, we took the basic wage approach, which is the net wage, and then deducted for income tax and other contributions. And then the other one was, is this going to be set at an hourly rate or is this a monthly rate? And, the hourly rate is advantageous. It's easy to remember, particularly if it's a nice round figure, which of course, as the minimum wage is adapted, is hardly ever the case. We started with 20 rand an hour and have now moved to, cents. So, yeah. But an hourly rate is easier to remember and it's easier to calculate. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily guarantee workers a minimum income over a period of a month, right? And so then thinking through, okay, well, what does it mean? And then how can you disincentivize casualization? And there's various ways. We can talk more about that also, that the South African sectoral determinations have done that. And so those were some of the debates. So I think that, obviously the consequences of any policy are somewhat uncertain. And I think it's really important to recognize what a national minimum wage is and what it isn't. The national minimum wage is not a form of generating employment, right? And oftentimes the debates sort of treated it as such. And it's important to keep in mind the other forms of employer support for workers, whether it's Social Security and so on, that are also important in guaranteeing workers' social reproduction. But it does have an important function, and one of its important functions is that it can, if set at a high enough level, and if it grows at a high enough level, it can be an important tool for transforming the labor market. So I think I'll leave it there. I just wanted to give a sort of short presentation that didn't repeat the questions or the video, but maybe raise more questions, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth, for that very interesting presentation. I think it's very relevant. For example, just in the case of the Philippines, there's agitation at the moment for a wage hike, and it's basically because of erosion due to inflation during the pandemic and then the fuel price hike. So those points raised actually are an echo in the debates here. So I guess that goes for other countries too, and again, most probably our participants would have something to ask about that presentation. But just to move things along, I have a couple of prepared questions. So just the first one to Ruth, what would you consider as best practices with regards to minimum wage setting in different countries that you either studied or are at least familiar with?
Thanks so much. I think the first element, and these are perhaps best practices in terms of process, and then I'll touch on some of the best practices in terms of sort of the details of the actual wage setting. I think it's important to have a social dialogue process, and for that to be a process that involves kind of iterative discussion, training, and debate. One of the challenges, I think, for the South African context was that actually trade unions had not actively mobilized around the national minimum wage, or not to the extent that we had expected during the process. They later came to the table. And if you talk about something like a phase-in approach, where you have some sectors that are just so low that they're not going to be able to meet the national minimum wage overnight, domestic work, agricultural work, it's essential to have worker power, not only in those sectors, but across the trade union movement, mobilized to actually ensure that those phase-ins happen, because otherwise they won't happen, right? And I think that's it's very easy for the minimum wages to erode. And so the social dialogue, but really thinking about worker power during that process is really important, and after that process. The second thing is, I think there's a real space for research in this, including research with and for trade unions. And economists play a really critical role. And some of these techniques, right, the modeling that some heterodox economists dislike can actually be used progressively. Yeah. So I would say, don't shun economic modeling. It's very important in order to justify particular positions to ministries of finance, et cetera, that do play an important role in these processes. And so we, for instance, at the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative, did a sort of range of studies. One that kind of looked conceptually at what is the relationship between the labor market, poverty, and inequality. And this, for South Africa, was very important because South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, right? So that was critical. The second area was around the structure of the labor market and the impact. We did a sort of modeling of the impact of various minimum wage levels, sort of looking at 3 examples and then seeing what the impact would be on poverty, on inequality, on the unemployment, right? And we're able through that to make the case that actually, by sector, there might be some changes, but on aggregate, employment effects were not significant at a particular level, right? And that was critical. These meta-analyses of data at the international level were also crucial. I think that here, there's a real kind of interest in what the impacts have been elsewhere, and that helped to make the case for us. And so I think that the research working very closely with the trade union movement is important, and that economists and modeling can play a progressive role. I think one thing we missed, and these are not so much best practices, I guess they're reflections on process, is that we didn't include, and the government also, the Department of Labor also didn't include the institutions of implementation. And here I'm talking about the committees for the mediation and arbitration of labor rights. Yeah, they were engaged at a later process. The assumption was you have policymakers, you have the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Labor, your tripartite or quadripartite bodies and academics, and then we'll deal with the institutions of implementation later. But actually, those institutions, the inspectorate, the committee for mediation and arbitration, know an awful lot about the intricacies and challenges of implementing and inspecting and enforcing labor protections. And had they been engaged at an earlier stage, I think that the national minimum wage and the instruments of enforcement would have been more appropriate. So those are some of the, I think, the elements of sort of process. And then, I mean, just to say quickly, and this was also, I think, pointed out in the video, our position has been that the basic wage is what should be the minimum wage, that tips and in-kind benefits and all these other things, they're not to be recommended. And that ultimately an hourly wage helps, but it doesn't deal with the issue of casualization. And there's some ways in which in South Africa, they have established in their sectoral determinations, they had all sorts of premiums in certain sectors for sort of casualization, essentially. So they limited, for instance, the categories of work that could be paid on an hourly basis. They stipulated the number of hours of work per day, the minimum hours. So even if you only worked 1 hour, you had to be paid for 4 or, what have you. And they established higher rates for part-time workers. So part of what's been interesting has been to try to reconcile the national minimum wage with the rules of the sectoral determination and not actually get rid of the sectoral determination. Those continue to be a reference points for the sectors. The collective bargaining agreements continue to regulate, those workers, the conditions of work under those. The national minimum wage is really just a floor, and so I think it doesn't discount then the importance of other forms of wage setting that reflect the type of organizing in particular sectors. I think that's about it. I mean, one of the arguments around, obviously the level of the minimum wage was the area of highest contention. And in countries that have relatively weak trade unions, right, the minimum wage tends to actually set the wage. And so obviously there was some discussion in trying to look at the average wages and see, what percentage of the average, can the average wage be a guide as well? But all of this, I don't think there's one best practice for any country. It really reflects what the structure of labor markets is and the wage structures in those places.
So yeah, thank you. So those are great things to think about. So social dialogue, research, of course, the role of trade union and worker power across all those issues. Yeah. So in terms of sectoral bargaining together with minimum wage setting at a national level, I remember in the discussion, this was the case also in Zimbabwe. So not just in South Africa, although that's not the case in the Philippines. So that's quite interesting to hear about that. So I think our participants would have some questions by now. Are there any from the floor? I see Cheng, so let's hear it from him.
Hello, Ruth. A long time. I just want to come to say hi. I'm sorry I missed part of your presentation. I was in another meeting. I think so nice to see you. Such a long time. I just want to have one comment on what you were highlighting. That's actually the heterodox economics and as well as the labor institutions actually in this process could play a role. Just one example, like here in Brazil, also the most unequal like a country in the world as well. And so what we see that once there's a minimum wage cannot really make to guarantee the livelihood of the people, then it's directly involved with social violence. And unfortunately, recently I have been robbed once on the street and it was really scary. And the point is this here in Brazil, like in Unicamp as an institution, as a university with the Sansich who are focused on the trade union studies and labor economics, we do have set like parameters of labor market indicators. And it's becoming a very important institution now, are providing many of the data for the labor markets, and as well as for the considerations for setting many things. The other things, as also I know that from a study like in Turkey, they also, like trade unions, they trying to set their own inflation rate. There are a group of like researchers. They went to markets and they are monitoring the price of the inflation in the market of the local level. So they set their own inflation rate, and that can be used for the increase of the minimum wage, or when we were talking about adjustments. So I think these are the things are very relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Cheng. But before we ask Ruth, do you have a question, Lira?
Well, it was by mistake.
Okay.
But there is one thing that I would want to ask Ruth, especially when it comes to the quality of data that you are working with, because I think especially for countries, developing countries, that becomes a big issue, especially if the institutions that are responsible for data collection are often under political influence. And then, they would just simply not collect the data that we want to have. Let that be, for instance, about the scale of casual work and what's really happening in the labor market. I just want to get a sense of you that I don't really like the best practices thing, but what are some of the insights you have had, when it comes to this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe you can answer those two questions and then ask the rest if there is still any. Yeah, Ruth.
Great. So Cheng, it's great to see you. Thanks. I think that the sort of approach, it's useful to know what the approach is in Brazil, and unions do also across the African continent have, calculate what is the basic basket of goods. And that value is much, much higher than what is defined by the poverty lines. So both in South Africa and in Mozambique, the way we've gone about calculating the line of working poverty is to take the upper bound poverty line and then to multiply it by your average households, the average size of household. But that line is significantly lower than those that are calculated by the trade unions. And as we're thinking about how to increase, what is the advocacy around minimum wage increases, one certainly should not be using the inflation, or inflation needs to be tied with something else, and this is where average wages and the labor market, there's pros and cons, because you can also peg it to one in a moment of economic growth that is more desirable, and then in another moment it's not. So I think it's always about how do you kind of put together a formula that brings a constellation of factors that can weather moments of crisis as well. But certainly inflation is not a good measure, because the basic baskets of goods are often much higher than the inflation. And if one of the objectives is to reduce inequality, then wages have to increase at a higher level, at a higher rate than average wages, right? So we don't just want to kind of keep pace with inflation. If the objective is actually to have some kind of transformation, then it needs to be increasing at a higher rate. And that requires constant political pressure as well as research. On Adlira's question, I think it's a really good one, because of, there's only a handful of countries on the African continent that have labor force surveys, right? And without having labor force surveys, it's very difficult to calculate, for instance, how many, what is the structures of sectors, how many of those workers are working below the line of working poverty, and to do that kind of modeling. And so that isn't possible. It's absolutely right. And that's where, these calculations on the basic basket of goods and productivity and so on then kind of come in to negotiations. I think one of the things I've noticed in the case of Mozambique, where I've also worked quite closely with the unions, is that it's an issue of data it's also an issue of economic orthodoxy, So many countries also don't have a pool of heterodox economists that are actually challenging some of the underlying assumptions about wage setting. And so you're not getting the kind of support from academia and from researchers, or trade unions are not, when they go to the bargaining table. So not only do you have a deficiency of data, but you also, the arguments don't move beyond a kind of sectoral analysis of productivity, or, and I think there is a danger that if one moves towards a national minimum wage setting process in a moment where trade unions are weak, and in a moment where you don't have a sort of adequate research support and adequate mobilization, the national minimum wage that can be set might actually be insignificant, or might be used to actually chip away at workers' rights. So I think, like with any policy, the devil is always in the details. And you can have something that seems progressive, but actually ends up being regressive, or vice versa.
Thank you, Ruth. So I'll again open the floor if there are any questions from our participants. Yes, George.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, thanks for this presentation. I just wanted to draw the body's attention to an instance like in Liberia, and let's see how can we find a way forward in this situation. Liberia is a country that is not so sophisticated in academia, so data is not so readily available. And I remember the last time they proposed a minimum wage was like 2015. It had not come into effect. There is no minimum wage board, nothing. The lawmakers themselves are not pushing this to come to reality, because a lot of them are themselves employers in a way. Many employers, they got some farms, they have some people working, and so they don't want to push hard for a minimum wage. They said $5. And I remember back then I was not very open with issues of minimum wage, but then we wanted to find out how did they arrive at this, and we're thinking it was too small, comparing a company like Firestone, how long they have been in the economy and how little they are paying their people and those things. But the argument the politicians pushed at us was, if we demanded for more as a minimum wage, what we will say for people who are self-employed or having few persons working for them, in the instance where in Liberia we have people who are in the, say, the food industry, cook prepared food, fast food, but these are very minimum entrepreneurs. They are not very big. Sometimes they have 2 or 3 persons working for them, and what they are doing is just what we call from hand to mouth. It is not anything very substantive. So they are asking us, how are these people going to be able to manage to pay that minimum wage to their employees? So then we are taken aback, and how can we go about it? So in a situation like this, what could be a good compromise in finding a minimum wage, a national minimum wage?
Yeah, before I ask Ruth to respond to George, let me ask first if there are any others. None for now, so maybe I can ask Ruth now to answer George.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. George, I think that is an excellent question. And where it comes up a lot is actually in relation to the domestic worker sector also, and it's actually been used to exclude domestic workers from minimum wage coverage in many countries. South Africa extended minimum wages to domestic workers, so it's not the case in South Africa, but there is this argument, how can you have a minimum wage for a domestic worker if a domestic worker herself employs someone as a domestic worker to take care of her children, right? And I'm sure that I'm assuming that's also an argument in other parts of the country. I think that there's been two answers to that. The first one is that minimum wages do in some ways shape the structure of an economy. And so if a group of workers is going to somehow fall under that minimum wage, the question is, can their wages go up to meet that level, right? And or what needs to happen to the reorganization of production in order for workers' wages to meet that level? And I'll give you a very a sort of example from South Africa. When domestic workers were incorporated into the sectoral determinations, their hours of work declined. They did, because employers shifted from a kind of weekly rate, right, where full-time domestic workers would work full-time, to working, hiring someone 2 to 3 days, maybe 1 day a week, right? So the hours of work for domestic workers declined. However, the wages at the end of the month increased. So it wasn't that domestic workers were laid off altogether. Rather, the structure of domestic work in South Africa was reorganized over time in a way that did result in less hours of work, but also resulted in higher pay at the end of the month. Okay? So I think that's how I would answer, is that there have to be, you can't accommodate all low wage sectors. And then the question is, what will be the implications, and what is the role of the state in providing support for sectors in order to reorganize in a way that ensures decent work, and what other forms of redistribution and so on are there in order to support those workers. There's also been the argument made, this was made around the national minimum wage, that perhaps you could think about differentiating, saying, okay, you have domestic work that is qualified and will be subjected to the national minimum wage, and then you have somehow domestic work that's unqualified, right? You try to differentiate in some way, but that leads you down a very slippery slope and kind of, it runs against the very objective of having a national minimum wage. So I think that drawing on international experience of cases where ultra low wage sectors or historically excluded sectors have been brought into the national minimum wage regime is really important. And that it's about in understanding kind of what the evidence is and what the implications may be, but also decentering this idea that minimum wages somehow generate employment, or don't, often the onus of generating employment then gets put on minimum wages. If we're suffering from an unemployment problem, then we need to reduce worker protections, right? As opposed to thinking about the other range of policies that can support employment creation. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's a very good one and a very tough one to address.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. So unless George has a follow-up, so we have a question from Gift. Hi, Gift.
Yes, how are you, Benji? It's not it's not a question per se, but the issue of setting up minimum wages is complicated depending on where you are coming from. But just to share experience from this side, from Zimbabwe, that we set minimum wages at sector level, at industrial level. But however, what determines that, the issues to determine how you set up that minimum wages are provided in terms of the law. And what are those issues other than the Convention 131? What are those issues? The issues, they are very specific, that the sectors must ensure that we protect high and we maintain high levels of employment. it also provides that in setting up of the minimum wages, you must ensure to protect high levels of productivity. You must promote economic competitiveness. You must promote economic and environmental sustainability. And the last of it is that you must then, after all this, satisfying all this, you must then mitigate the cost of living. You see, so these are set guidelines that actually guide you in terms of setting up minimum wages. So we have two situations now, where there is a national minimum wage, which was gazetted by the government sometime in June or July 2017. And we have sector minimum wages that are continuously reviewed every 3 months. If you look at the national minimum wage as it stands right now, it's around, in terms of our local currency, is around 2,600 Zim dollars. If you convert it into US dollars, it's less than $20, 20 US dollars. That's the national minimum wage that is currently applicable. But when you go to the sector levels now, to the sector bargaining structures, they have minimum wages which are, in terms of the US dollar figure, which are around 360 US dollars. So you'd find a national minimum wage which is insignificant, totally insignificant. And you would find sector minimum wages which are relatively fine by our standards. So that's the challenge now that we have to say, in terms of setting those minimum wages, what are issues that we must look into? And there's a big contestation here. People always argue, the government has always said that you don't have to refer to the poverty datum line as a reference for you in setting up minimum wages. They said, no, you can't do that. To an extent that the government has barred the research institutes from publishing the poverty datum line on a monthly basis. They said, no, you no longer do that. What you must publish is what is called the TCPL, which is the total consumption poverty line per each individual. So for a negotiator to say, to go and negotiate a minimum wage, it will be very difficult now to say, for you to go and argue on the basis of the TCPL, it becomes very complicated, because you have to calculate in terms of how big that family is. And they will tell you that your TCPL and your poverty datum line in terms of the number of your family, like 5, is different from mine. I'm just married, it's me, Gift, and my wife. So my poverty datum line is totally different from you. So it becomes tricky in terms of setting the minimum wage for the industry. So the policies that have been put in place and the guidelines makes it very difficult for sectors and even for the government itself to set a fair minimum wage, a minimum wage that we can accept as workers. So those are some of the challenges or the complications that we find in terms of how best we can set minimum wage.
Yeah, thank you, Gif. Although as I understand from Gif's introduction, it wasn't really a question, so it's an sharing from the situation in Zimbabwe. So let me ask Rasak before I call on Ruth again.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, we can hear you, Rasak.
Okay. Yeah, the challenges we are facing here in Nigeria is that when the minimum wage is being increased, the inflation tends to rise again, which it seems as if they didn't, minimum wage did not increase. What I want to ask now, that is there any ILO convention that seek for minimum wage review. As in, like in case of Nigeria, it's every 5 years that we review our minimum wage. Is there any ILO convention that guide upward review of minimum wage? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rasak. So let me call on Ruth either to respond to Rasak, and also if you have any reactions to Gift's sharing.
Yeah, so thank you both to Gift and Razak for sharing. I mean, Gift, I think your description of the kinds of factors that need to be included in the wage setting process, I think are really highlight part of the problem. and by the way, I don't think Zimbabwe is unique, right? This idea that minimum wages need to ensure productivity, promote economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability. And the question is the minimum wage the right instrument to do these things? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the World Bank's now rather discredited Doing Business report. But the Doing Business report, I think, is still useful, not in terms of their actual rankings, but in terms of the kinds of issues that were raised, which are about starting a business, dealing with permits, getting the proper infrastructure, registering property, access to credit, protecting investors, the tax system, enforcing contracts, resolving problems of insolvency. These were the concerns that businesses put forward that have to do with the kinds of how they see it, the kind of environment that they're concerned with. And so to assume, as often becomes the case, that wages are the determining factor simply doesn't reflect the host of other issues. And of course, well-being should be the number one priority, because that's what this particular policy instrument can do. And there's other policy instruments that can show the other, that can address some of the other elements. Is there an ILO convention? I'm not sure. And here, I mean, Benjamin has actually a lot of experience in this area, and you may be able to answer this question better than I. I don't know that there's a convention, but what is true is that countries have widely different periods. So some countries will review, as you saw in Zim, every 3 months. The Netherlands used to be every 6 months. South Africa, it's a sort of annual basis. In Mozambique, it's generally annual, except when there's a crisis. 5 years is a long time. And so whether there's a convention or not, I think that the international practice suggests that is not the desirable way to go. And of course, over that time period, it's extremely problematic. The last thing I would just say is, I think we do have to, one of the advantages of the national minimum wage is that it thinks about the economy as a whole and not specific sectors. And that allows for a kind of, to take into account the general health of the economy rather than sort of specific productivity indicators per sector. But of course, to do so requires, as Adlira already mentioned, data, and it requires challenging some of these economic orthodoxies. One last thing I just wanted to mention, because I know we're running out of time, is one of the questions that's emerged in a place like South Africa is who then gets covered under the national minimum wage. So what is the definition of worker? And South Africa actually has quite an expansive definition of worker that would include, for instance, the small vendor that couldn't, that is working for someone else, et cetera. But that's important, how is worker defined? But still, platform workers, for instance, aren't automatically considered under the national minimum wage. And one of the issues that we're now focused on at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies is thinking about what does it mean to regulate platform work? Can this legislation that defined a sort of broad understanding of worker be extended to the sector? Do platform workers themselves want that legislation to be extended to them. But certainly, in the context of growing casualization, that becomes key. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ruth. As for the convention, as far as I know, there's no convention too that specifically says anything. The ILO has a minimum wage policy guide, right? So there's a section there that says that minimum wages have to be adjusted. But I guess the term they use is just for an appropriate period of time. So usually the language of the ILO, it has to be according to local customs or laws, I mean, and then that social dialogue is an integral part. So anyway, so this is we can go on discussing minimum wages, but we have to end this because we have another workshop coming up in 5 minutes. So thank you again to Ruth for the great insights and our participants for very relevant questions. So I hope to see our participants again in our next workshop in 5 minutes. So thank you.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
good day.